There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a valley town in late May. The kind where the air smells like wet grass and wood smoke, where the streets are still a little muddy from the spring rains, where children are finally back outside after a long winter, and the sound of them drifts through open windows in the early evening. It's the kind of quiet that feels permanent, the kind that makes you believe, without really thinking about it, that tomorrow will look a lot like today. Johnstown, Pennsylvania felt like that in the spring of 1889. It was a working town, a real one in the way that not many towns are anymore. The kind of place where everybody's hands showed what they did for a living. The Cambria Iron Works dominated the valley floor, its furnaces running day and night, turning out steel rails that would end up on railroad lines across the country. The men who worked there came home with soot in the creases of their knuckles and a particular kind of tiredness that wasn't unpleasant. The tiredness of people who had done something real with their day. The town had been built in a place that geography should have warned against, but nobody was listening to geography in 1889. Johnstown sat at the confluence of two rivers, the Stony Creek and the Little Conemaugh, in a narrow valley surrounded by steep hills. When it rained hard and long enough, the rivers rose. Everybody in Johnstown knew this. They had lived with seasonal flooding for years. It was part of the rhythm of the place, an inconvenience, something you planned around, something your boots were good for. What they didn't fully know, what most of them had no real reason to know, was what was sitting 14 miles upstream in the mountains above them. The South Fork Dam had been built in the 1840s as part of a state canal system that was already becoming obsolete before the dam was even finished. The idea was to create a reservoir that would feed a canal route across the Allegheny Mountains, one of those grand infrastructure projects that seemed absolutely essential right up until the railroad made it unnecessary. By 1857, the canal system had been sold off to the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the dam with it. The railroad had no use for it. They drained the reservoir and removed one of the discharge pipes to use elsewhere, which is the kind of decision that seems perfectly reasonable in the moment and catastrophic in hindsight. The dam sat there, unused and deteriorating, for over a decade. Then, in 1879, a group of wealthy Pittsburgh industrialists and businessmen bought the property for a private resort. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. The membership list reads like a directory of Gilded Age power. Andrew Carnegie was a member, Andrew Mellon, Henry Clay Frick. The kind of men whose names are still on buildings today, whose portraits hang in museums, whose philanthropic legacies have been polished so thoroughly over the decades that it's easy to forget what their actual day-to-day decisions looked like. They wanted a lake, a private one, stocked with bass and perch, surrounded by cottages and a clubhouse, accessible only to members. So they had the dam repaired and the reservoir refilled. Here's where the decisions start to accumulate in ways that matter. The repairs were done cheaply. The men overseeing them were not engineers in any meaningful sense of the word. The discharge pipes that had been removed were never replaced. A fish screen was installed across the spillway to prevent the stocked fish from escaping downstream, which had the side effect of allowing debris to accumulate and restrict water flow during heavy rains. The crown of the dam was lowered by several feet to allow two carriages to pass side by side across the top, a convenience for club members arriving from Pittsburgh. Local engineers who looked at the dam over the years expressed concern. Some of them wrote letters. The club received those letters, acknowledged them, and did essentially nothing. The dam held. Years passed. Nothing happened. And the longer nothing happened, the less urgent the concerns seemed. This is one of the quiet tragedies within the larger one. Not malice exactly, Not stupidity exactly. Just the ordinary human tendency to discount warnings that haven't yet become disasters. To let the comfortable present crowd out the uncomfortable future. To assume that because something has held so far, it will continue to hold. The reservoir at full capacity held approximately 20 million tons of water. May 1889 was wet. Unusually, persistently, relentlessly wet. A slow-moving storm system had been sitting over western Pennsylvania for days, dropping rain across the entire watershed above Johnstown. The rivers were already running high when, on the night of May 30th and into the morning of May 31st, the storm intensified. Some areas received 6 to 8 inches of rain in less than 24 hours. The hills were saturated. Every creek and tributary was running fast and brown and full. Up at the South Fork Reservoir, the water level had been rising steadily for days. By the morning of May 31st, it was within a foot of the top of the dam. The club's engineer, John Park, had been watching it anxiously. He organized work crews to try to raise the dam's crown, which was already too low, and to clear debris from the fish screens. Neither effort was enough to meaningfully change what was coming. Park sent riders and messengers down to Johnstown to warn them. This is a detail that matters. There were warnings, multiple warnings, throughout the morning of May 31st that the dam was in danger of failing. The problem was that warnings about this dam had been sent down to Johnstown before, over the years, and nothing had ever happened. The dam had always held. The valley had flooded before, yes, but from the rivers, not from a dam failure. People in Johnstown had developed, entirely reasonably given their experience, a kind of tolerant skepticism about dam warnings. When the warnings came down on the morning of May 31st, some people took them seriously enough to move their belongings to upper floors. Most went about their day. The dam failed at approximately 3:10 in the afternoon. When an earthen dam fails, it doesn't crack or crumble gradually. It gives way. The water finds a weakness, and then the weakness becomes a gap, and the gap becomes a breach. And in a matter of minutes, the entire structure is simply gone, and 20 million tons of water are moving downhill at the speed of an express train. The wave that came down the Little Conemaugh Valley was not what most people imagine when they picture a flood. It wasn't a wall of clear water rising steadily from below. It was a roaring, churning mass of debris, a moving wreckage, carrying with it everything the water had picked up on its way down the mountain. Trees, houses, barns, railroad cars, sections of bridges. The accumulated stuff of a dozen small communities that the flood had already destroyed before it reached Johnstown. The sound of it preceded it. People who survived described hearing it before they saw it. A low roar that built into something that shook the ground, that rattled windows, that sounded like nothing they had a word for because nothing in their experience had prepared them for it. The wave hit Johnstown at approximately 4:07 in the afternoon. It took less than 10 minutes to destroy most of the city. In those 10 minutes, houses were lifted off their foundations and carried hundreds of yards. Buildings that had stood for decades were reduced to splinters. The Cambria Iron Works, the economic heart of the town, was swept through. Streets that had been full of people going about a Friday afternoon disappeared under 30 feet of moving water and debris. People drowned in their houses before they could reach the upper floors. People who made it to rooftops were carried away when the rooftops themselves broke free. Families were separated in seconds. Parents lost children. Children lost parents. People grabbed whatever was floating past and held on, riding the debris field through what had been their neighborhood, past what had been their neighbors' houses, unable to do anything but hold on. At the lower end of Johnstown, where the valley narrowed, the debris accumulated against the old stone bridge. The bridge held, and as the wreckage piled up against it, 30 acres of debris formed a dam of its own, a shifting, unstable mass of broken wood and twisted metal and every kind of thing that had been in the valley that morning. And then it caught fire. Nobody knows exactly how it started. Oil from the railroad cars, probably, or coal, or any number of flammable things caught in the wreckage. But the debris field against the stone bridge burned through the night of May 31st into June 1st, and some of the people who had survived the flood itself, who had made it onto the debris pile, who had been clinging to pieces of their former lives in the dark, were killed by the fire. The death toll from the Johnstown flood was 2,209 people. It remains one of the deadliest disasters in American history. Among the dead were 99 entire families who left no survivors to identify them. Nearly 400 of the bodies recovered were never identified at all. The morning of June 1st, 1889, in Johnstown, was something that defies easy description. The water had receded enough to reveal what was left, which was not much. Where a city of 30,000 people had stood the previous day, there was mud and wreckage and silence. The kind of silence that follows catastrophe. The silence of absence, of the ordinary sounds of a city, voices and cartwheels, and the distant clang of the ironworks, simply no longer being there. The survivors came out of wherever they had spent the night. Some had made it to the hills above the floodline and watched from there as their city was destroyed. Some had spent the night on rooftops or in the upper stories of the few buildings still standing. Some had ridden the debris field for miles before finding something stable to hold on to. Some had been rescued by neighbors who managed, in the chaos, to pull people from the water at enormous risk to themselves. What they found when they came down into what remained of Johnstown was almost impossible to process. The landscape itself had changed. Streets they had walked their entire lives were unrecognizable. Familiar landmarks were gone. The geography of the valley had been rearranged by the force of 20 million tons of water moving at 40 miles per hour. And the bodies were everywhere. In the debris, in the mud, in the ruins of houses, tangled in the wreckage along the stone bridge. The survivors who had lost family members had to make the terrible decision between searching for them and attending to the immediate demands of staying alive, finding food and clean water and shelter in a place where all of those things had just been destroyed. Reverend David Beale, a Presbyterian minister who lived through the flood and wrote about it afterward, described the morning of June 1st with a kind of measured precision that somehow makes it more affecting than if he had written dramatically. He wrote about walking through the debris field, about the quietness of it, about the way ordinary objects, a child's shoe, a family Bible open to a particular page, a clock stopped at the moment the water hit, seemed to carry more weight than they had any right to. He wrote about a man he found sitting in the ruins of his house, not doing anything, just sitting there. The man had lost his wife and 3 children. He wasn't crying. He wasn't speaking. He was just sitting, and Beale wrote that he couldn't think of anything to say to him. So he sat with him for a while in silence, and then eventually moved on. That image has stayed with me for a long time. The two of them sitting together in the ruins of a house, in a destroyed city, with nothing adequate to say. It's the most human detail in the whole story, somehow. More human than the heroism or the statistics or the political aftermath. Just a man sitting in what's left of his life, and another man who understood that there was nothing to say but stayed anyway. News of the disaster reached the outside world quickly. The telegraph lines were down in Johnstown itself, but riders got through to nearby communities. And by the evening of May 31st, newspapers across the country were beginning to receive reports. By June 1st, it was on the front page of every major paper in the United States. The public response was extraordinary. This was, in some ways, one of the first major national relief efforts in American history, and it established patterns that would shape how the country responded to disasters for decades to come. Clara Barton arrived in Johnstown with a team of Red Cross volunteers. It was one of the organization's earliest major deployments in the United States, and Barton herself would later write that Johnstown confirmed for her both the necessity and the capacity of organized relief work. Money poured in from across the country and from abroad. The total amount raised for Johnstown relief eventually reached several $million, which in 1889 was an almost incomprehensible sum. Governments sent aid, organizations sent supplies, individuals sent whatever they had. There's something in this response that feels important to note. The instinct, when confronted with the scale of what happened to Johnstown, to do something, anything, to reach across the distance and offer whatever help was possible. Supplies arrived faster than they could be organized. The logistics of relief in a city that had no functioning infrastructure were enormously complicated. Roads were damaged or destroyed. The railroad tracks were torn up. The bridges were gone. Getting food, medicine, and building materials into the valley required improvisation on a massive scale. General Daniel Hastings of the Pennsylvania National Guard arrived to organize relief and maintain order. His reports from the first days after the flood paint a picture of enormous complexity. The competing demands of searching for survivors and bodies, feeding and sheltering tens of thousands of displaced people, preventing looting, coordinating the arrival of supplies from dozens of different sources, and trying to make decisions about what to do with a city that had essentially ceased to exist. The question of accountability was raised almost immediately. Within days of the flood, journalists were writing about the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, about the wealthy men who had owned the dam, about the repairs that hadn't been made, and the warnings that hadn't been heeded. The coverage was, by the standards of the time, remarkably pointed. The names of club members were published. The history of the dam's condition was documented. The connection between the club's negligence and the deaths of 2,209 people was stated plainly in newspapers read by millions. And yet, no member of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was ever held legally responsible for the Johnstown flood. Not one. The lawsuits that were filed against the club were unsuccessful. Pennsylvania courts held that the flood was an act of God, a legal concept that shielded the club members from liability. The same men whose names appeared in the newspapers, whose portraits hung in banks, and whose influence shaped Pennsylvania politics, continued their lives essentially unchanged. Andrew Carnegie contributed money to the relief fund and helped finance the construction of a new library in Johnstown, which is the kind of gesture that feels more complicated the longer you look at it. Henry Clay Frick sent a check. The club itself was quietly dissolved. Its members moved on to other things. Their fortunes, built on the steel and coal that had turned Pittsburgh into an industrial powerhouse, continued to grow. The people of Johnstown rebuilt. That fact deserves its own moment, its own silence. Within days of the flood, survivors were already beginning to clear debris and talk about reconstruction. Within months, the Cambria Iron Works was partially operating again. Within a few years, Johnstown had rebuilt itself into something that looked, from the outside, like a functioning city again. But the people who had been there on May 31st, 1889, carried what they had experienced in ways that didn't show on the rebuilt streets and the new houses. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't a concept that existed in 1889, not as a named, recognized condition. But the thing it names existed, obviously. It has always existed. And the survivors of Johnstown lived with it, most of them quietly, because the culture of the time didn't give them much space to do otherwise. There was a woman named Gertrude Quinn who was 6 years old on May 31st, 1889. She survived by being swept out of her house on a mattress, carried through the debris field, and eventually pulled to safety by a man named Maxwell McCachran, who spotted her from a piece of floating debris and managed to get to her in time. She wrote about it decades later, when she was an old woman, and what strikes me about her account is how clearly she remembered the small details. Not just the terror of the water, though she remembered that too, but the texture of the mattress under her hands, the color of the sky, the sound of her own voice calling out. Memory works that way with the experiences that mark us most deeply. It goes precise rather than blurry. It preserves details that wouldn't seem important to an outside observer, but that become, for the person who lived through it, the specific coordinates of a before and an after. She remembered Maxwell McCachran's face. She remembered what he said to her when he pulled her to safety. Something quiet and reassuring that she couldn't quite reproduce word for word, but whose tone she remembered exactly. She tracked him down years later, as an adult, to thank him properly. He had spent those years not thinking of himself as a hero, just as someone who had done what the moment required, which is usually how actual heroism works. Gertrude Quinn Ehrenfeld, as she became, lived to be 88 years old. She talked about the flood her entire life, not obsessively, but honestly, in the way that people talk about the things that shaped them. She had lost family members on May 31st. She had lost neighbors, friends, the entire physical context of her childhood. What remained was memory, and she kept it carefully. There are other stories like hers that survived, preserved in letters and memoirs and newspaper accounts, and the records of the relief organizations that worked in Johnstown in the weeks and months after the flood. A man named Victor Heiser, who was 16 at the time, survived by climbing to the roof of his family's barn as the water rose, watching the barn break free of its foundation and carry him through the flood, and making a series of split-second decisions about when to jump from one piece of debris to another that he later said he couldn't entirely explain. He went on to become a physician who spent his career working on public health in Asia. And he wrote about Johnstown in his autobiography with the particular clarity of someone who had been close enough to death to recalibrate everything afterward. He wrote about the randomness of it, about how the difference between survival and death in many cases came down to where you happened to be standing at 4:07 on a Friday afternoon. One side of a street or the other. One room of a house or the one next to it. He wrote about this not with bitterness, but with a kind of sober acknowledgement that it was true, that survival wasn't a reward for virtue or preparation or anything else. It was, in many cases, simply where you were. That kind of randomness is something people struggle to hold on to. It doesn't fit neatly into the narrative structures we use to make sense of events. We want disasters to be comprehensible, to have clear causes and clear lessons, to sort people into those who took the right precautions and those who didn't, to produce a moral that we can carry forward. And there are real lessons from Johnstown, real things about infrastructure and accountability and the gap between private wealth and public safety. But underneath those lessons is the harder thing, the thing Victor Heiser was pointing at, which is that sometimes catastrophe is also just luck, and the survivors have to live with that too. The physical rebuilding of Johnstown happened relatively quickly by the standards of the time. The Cambria Ironworks, which employed such a large proportion of the town's population, was a powerful economic incentive for reconstruction. The company's owners wanted production back online. Workers wanted their jobs back. The valley had a reason to put itself back together that was practical and immediate, and not dependent on sentiment. By 1890, a year after the flood, Johnstown's population was actually larger than it had been before. People who had left came back. New people came in, drawn by the economic activity of reconstruction. The streets were laid out again. New buildings went up. The rivers were partially controlled with new walls and channels designed to reduce future flooding risk. The reconstruction wasn't perfect, and it wasn't equal. The wealthiest residents of Johnstown, those who had the resources to rebuild quickly or to simply leave and start over elsewhere, recovered faster than the working-class families who had lost everything they had. The immigrants, many of them Eastern European workers who had come to work in the iron mills, had the fewest resources and the least access to relief aid, which was sometimes distributed in ways that reflected the racial and ethnic hierarchies of the time. This is a pattern that repeats across disaster history. The physical recovery of a place often happens faster than the social and economic recovery of its most vulnerable residents. The rebuilt streets can look whole, while the people walking them are still very much in the process of piecing themselves back together. The political aftermath of the flood was complicated, and in the end, largely disappointing for those who hoped it would produce meaningful accountability. The investigation that followed established clearly enough what had happened to the dam and why. The engineering failures were documented. The history of neglected repairs and ignored warnings was laid out. The connection between the club's decisions and the deaths of more than 2,000 people was established to the satisfaction of most objective observers. But the legal system of 1889 Pennsylvania was not designed to hold wealthy men accountable for the downstream consequences of their private property decisions. The concept of corporate liability was still in its early stages. The legal doctrine that natural disasters could absolve property owners of responsibility for damage caused by their failures was well established and consistently applied. The club members hired good lawyers, as powerful men do, and the cases against them went nowhere. Some of the survivors and their families wrote angry letters to newspapers. Some of the newspapers wrote angry editorials. Some politicians made angry speeches. None of it resulted in any meaningful consequences for the men who had owned the South Fork Dam. This outcome shaped how Johnstown remembered the flood and how it was remembered by the broader public. The anger about accountability, the sense that powerful men had caused a catastrophe and walked away from it, became part of the story in ways that were sometimes explicit and sometimes ran just beneath the surface of the official commemorations and historical accounts. There's a particular quality to the way places remember their own tragedies. It's not simple grief, though grief is part of it. It's something more complicated, a mixture of pride in survival, sorrow for what was lost, anger at what caused it, and a kind of determined insistence on not being defined entirely by the worst thing that ever happened. Johnstown has carried all of those things for more than a century now. The Johnstown Flood National Memorial was established in 1964 by an act of Congress. It sits at the site of the South Fork Dam, on the hillside above the valley where the reservoir once was. If you go there on a quiet day, you can stand at the edge of what was once the dam and look down the valley toward where Johnstown sits, 14 miles away. The valley is green and peaceful now. The rivers run quietly. The hills are covered in second-growth forest. Nothing about the landscape announces what happened here. The memorial preserves what it can. The foundations of some of the old South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club cottages are still visible. The outline of the dam can still be traced in the landscape if you know where to look. The visitor center tells the story as completely as a building can. But the real memorial, if there is one, is in the telling. In the accounts that survived, the letters and memoirs and newspaper stories that were carefully preserved and carefully read. In the names of the 2,209 people who died, which are recorded and maintained. In the photographs of the destruction, which are among the most widely reproduced disaster photographs of the 19th century, that specific image of the wreckage of an entire city that makes the scale of what happened impossible to dismiss. I want to stay with the names for a moment, because they're easy to lose in the larger numbers. Among the dead were 99 entire families wiped out completely. No survivors to file a claim or give a name or carry the loss forward. They're known only from census records and city directories and the memories of neighbors who survived. Families who had come to Johnstown from Poland, Hungary, Ireland, Italy, Wales, looking for work in the iron mills, who had built small lives in a working-class neighborhood on the valley floor, and who were simply gone on the morning of June 1st, with no one left to remember them. There's something in that particular kind of erasure that goes beyond the tragedy of individual deaths. When a whole family dies and there are no survivors, the loss doesn't just happen once. It happens again every time there's no one to tell the story, no one to carry the names forward, no one to say this is who they were, this is what they cared about, this is how they laughed. The Red Cross and relief workers tried to document as much as they could. The identifications made were painstaking, comparing recovered bodies against census records and the testimony of neighbors. But nearly 400 people were never identified. They were buried in mass graves and marked with numbers rather than names, which is its own kind of grief. Ellen Hurst was 23 years old on May 31st, 1889. She worked at a dry goods store on Main Street and lived in a boarding house 2 blocks away. She had come to Johnstown from rural Pennsylvania 3 years earlier, looking for the kind of life that a small town couldn't offer, the small independence of a wage and a room of her own and a city around her. She survived the flood by making it to the upper floor of the boarding house as the water rose. She spent the night of May 31st there with 7 other people, listening to the debris field burn at the stone bridge, watching the glow of it from the window. In the morning, she was one of the people who walked out into the ruins. She wrote a letter to her mother 2 days later, when the mail was beginning to function again. The letter is preserved in a collection of flood correspondence at the Johnstown Area Heritage Association. It runs to 4 pages in her careful handwriting, and it is mostly practical, describing what happened, what she had lost, what she needed, what the town looked like now. But near the end, she writes something that has stayed with me. She writes, "I keep thinking about how it was just a regular Friday. Mrs. Patterson at the store was showing me the new summer fabrics that came in Thursday. I was thinking I might buy a length of the blue muslin if I could manage the price. And then 4 o'clock came, and it was all different." That's it. No elaboration. No attempt to make it mean something larger. Just the blue muslin and 4 o'clock and everything being different. The specific, ordinary weight of a before and an after. The Cambria Iron Works reopened its main facility in August 1889, less than 3 months after the flood. This was partly a matter of economic necessity, and partly, the company's management understood, a matter of something harder to name: the psychological importance to the community of the mill running again. of the sound and the smoke and the familiar rhythm of shifts starting and ending. The men who went back to work in August 1889 were the same men who had lost houses and family members and neighbors in May. They went back to work because they needed the wages, and because work was what they knew, and because there is a kind of healing in doing something physical and purposeful and familiar when the world has just come apart. The ironworks would continue to be the economic center of Johnstown for decades. The city's story after 1889 is in many ways the story of that mill, of its cycles of expansion and contraction, of the waves of immigration that brought workers from across Europe, of the labor movements that organized in its shadow, of the eventual decline of American steel in the latter part of the 20th century, and what that meant for a city that had organized itself entirely around making things from iron and coal. But that's a longer story for another night. What matters here, in this particular night, is just this. The men who went back to work in August 1889 were there. They had been through something that most people will never go through, and they went back anyway. And they made the steel that made the rails that built the infrastructure of the country that was already beginning to forget about them. There's a historian named David McCullough who wrote the definitive account of the Johnstown Flood, published in 1968, that is still the book people reach for when they want to understand what happened. McCullough was a young writer when he researched it, and the book has a quality that his later, grander histories sometimes lack, a quality of genuine discovery, of a writer figuring out in real time what the story is and why it matters. He was particularly interested in the gap between the official narrative of the disaster, the one about the dam failure and the flood and the heroic recovery, and the human story underneath it, the one about specific people on a specific afternoon, making specific decisions that they couldn't have known would be the last decisions of their lives. He interviewed survivors. In 1968, there were still people alive who had been children in Johnstown in 1889, who had grown up with the flood as the defining fact of their early lives. He talked to them, took their memories seriously, tried to preserve the texture of what it had actually been like in ways that official histories tend to smooth over. One thing he noticed, and that comes through clearly in the book, is how ordinary the morning of May 31st had been. Not just for the residents of Johnstown, but even for the men working at the dam. John Park, the engineer who had been watching the water level rise anxiously for days, had still managed to eat breakfast that morning, to do ordinary things, to exist in the ordinary rhythms of a day even while the extraordinary thing was building above him. This is one of the quietly important truths about catastrophe. It doesn't always announce itself dramatically. It doesn't always give you the kind of warning that would allow you to act differently. Sometimes it builds in the background of perfectly ordinary days, and by the time it's visible, it's already too late to change the outcome. The weather on the morning of June 1st, 1889, the day after the flood, was clear. The storm that had caused all of this had moved on. The sun came up over the hills around Johnstown and illuminated the debris field and the mud and the ruins in sharp, clear light that had nothing apologetic about it. The hills were green. The sky was the particular blue of early summer in Pennsylvania. The birds were singing. This is the kind of detail that survivors mentioned almost universally in their accounts of the morning after. The weather's indifference. The way the ordinary world just kept going. The sunlight and the birdsong and the smell of the air, while the human world was trying to take in what had happened to it. Clara Barton, who had seen disasters before and would see more, wrote in her journal about standing in Johnstown on the morning of June 2nd and feeling something she described as the contrast. The word she used, in her precise, careful handwriting, was contrast. Between the beauty of the valley and the sunlight and the destruction in it. Between the way things looked and the way they were. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The word itself was enough. I think about Johnstown sometimes when I'm in places that feel permanent, solid towns with deep roots, places where the same families have lived for generations, places where the buildings are old enough to have weathered a lot, and the streets are worn smooth by decades of use. There's a comfort in places like that, a sense that the world has been organized in a particular way, and that organization has proven itself by lasting. The streets are where they are because they've been there long enough that moving them would seem absurd. The buildings stand because they've always stood. The river runs where it runs. Johnstown felt like that too, on the morning of May 31st, 1889. It had been a city for 50 years. The ironworks had been running for decades. The streets were familiar to everyone who walked them, in ways that go beyond knowing where things are. The way you know a place when you've lived in it long enough that it becomes part of how you understand yourself. And then, the afternoon came. The South Fork Dam site is quiet now. The valley is farmland and second-growth woods. The reservoir is gone, has been gone for more than a century, replaced by fields and trees. You can walk the path along what was once the shoreline, and it's just a path through the woods, unremarkable, peaceful. Standing there, looking down the valley toward where Johnstown is, you have to work to imagine the water. To imagine what 20 million tons of water looked like when it was all held here. When this hollow in the hills was full to its edges. When the dam held it all back. And then you have to work to imagine it letting go. The breach opening, the water finding the weakness becoming the gap becoming nothing, and all of that water beginning to move. 14 miles in about an hour. The mathematics of it are easy enough. The reality of it is something else. 2,209 people. I want to end with that number and let it mean what it means. Not as a statistic, not as a measure of the disaster's historical significance, not as a data point in an argument about infrastructure policy or Gilded Age inequality, though it is all of those things too. Just as people. 2,209 of them, who got up on the morning of May 31st, 1889, and ate breakfast, and went to work, and argued with their children about chores, and thought about what they needed from the store, and planned small things for the weekend. There were 99 entire families among them, who left no survivors. There were nearly 400 individuals who were never identified. There were men who had come from Poland and Hungary and Ireland looking for work in the mills. There were women who had made their own way to Johnstown in search of something the place they came from couldn't offer. There were children who had never seen anything but this valley, who knew its hills and its rivers and its streets the way children know the world they were born into. They were there on May 31st. And then they weren't. The valley is quiet tonight. The rivers are running at their usual levels, the Stony Creek and the Little Conemaugh moving in their channels, doing what rivers do. The hills above the city are dark against the sky. 14 miles upstream, on the hillside where the dam once stood, there's nothing left to see. The earth has healed over the breach. The grass grows. The trees are tall now, old enough that their roots go down deep into what was once the dam's foundation. It's a good night to remember them. Not dramatically, not with any particular ceremony, just quietly. The way the valley itself remembers them, which is simply by being there, by continuing, by the ordinary persistence of a place that survived something that should have ended it. The water came, and then it was gone. And the people who remained stayed. That's the story. Or the part of it that fits in a single night. The rest of it is in the archives, in the letters, in the photographs, in the names on the memorial. It's in the rebuilt streets of Johnstown, which are still there, still functioning, still full of people going about their days, in the valley where all of this happened. Sleep well. The rivers are quiet tonight.